Slava Ukraini. And this becomes very international. It becomes out of basically everyone knows the Slava Ukraini thing since we got European Parliament addressing, we got Zelensky addressing European Parliament, and then they got him they responded to him with Heroyam Slava. It just happened this week, and this is one of these fundamental breakthroughs in treating Ukrainian resistance, which was never a case for decades. And now it becomes reality. And now what we try to do here at Ukrainian Media Network, we decided with Marek Suprun and Stefan Bandera, we decided to establish our first English language podcast, broadcast, our streaming news and whatever, columnism, and we're talking books, we're talking news, we're talking tendencies, we're talking figures, and we're talking main, absolutely important and crucially needed tendencies that are somehow concerned with Ukrainian resistance and with the world's. I don't know what happened, but oh yeah, we just got Stefko, but so we're on air on Friday, and this is going to be our English language segment of UMN podcasts and broadcasts, and here we go. Let's rock and roll.
Glory to Ukraine.
Glory to Ukraine.
That's the English language translation, in case anyone was wondering, although I'm not sure if that even needs to be translated anymore, given that Slava Ukraini has become the lingua franca of people supporting Ukraine. So here we go.
Here we go. Friday night. It's morning in Winnipeg, Canada. It's almost late night in Kiev, which is in the blackout, because we got a series of warning signs that there's going to be another Russian attack. Hopefully it's not the case, but we're aware of that. And so here we go. And let's get to the basic and the most important news of the last week and of the last few days. And I think that we could start with the case that basically was announced and was in the news last week, last Thursday. We got this breakthrough in Manhattan court that finally seized the assets of certain Malofeyev. And these names tell a story to every Ukrainian who was following the news of annexation of Crimea. But I'm really puzzled whether this name, Konstantin Malofeyev, rings the bell to the Canadian, British, and American audience. Because from what I see, I got a lot of, we saw a lot of coverage of Malofeyev and the court in Manhattan that seized $5 million from him. One of the oligarchs who is apparently Putin's crony and who is known for his connections to Putin. But it was only Ukrainian news and Ukrainian outlets that reported on a deeper, I would say, and darker role of Malofeyev in this whole Putin's adventure in Ukraine that started, formally started in 2014, but as we all know, it started way earlier than that. But my question, gentlemen, is how deep and thorough were the Western coverage of Malofeyev's, I would say, career?
Stavko, why don't you take the lead in answering that?
Non-existent. Non-existent, really. People here, the thing with the Western media, they really have to, they tend to simplify things for audiences, and this cast of characters, they're gotten used to Zelensky. In terms of associating him with Ukraine, and all these other kind of minor characters in this whole thing, in Canada, I think if you were to ask people on the street who is Malofeyev, they would make square eyes at you and shake their head.
Mark, what do you think?
I have to agree. I mean, frankly, I think the only news that mattered recently to the United States is the FBI agent who was head of the New York branch of the FBI. That's the second biggest office after DC, who was implicated in providing, I suppose, advanced information to certain oligarchs in order to evade sanctions. And that what happened, I'm not sure, Stefko, maybe you remember exactly when that went down. I think it was a couple of, just in January, I think.
Charles McGonigal and Sergei Shestakov, the guys that are working for Deripaska or took Deripaska's money. And just shows really the level of penetration of the Putin's tentacles into the West. I mean, they got an FBI person, an FBI. He was serving as FBI special agent, and he received classified information that Deripaska is going to be added to a list of oligarchs considered for sanctions, and then, offered his services to make a case for Deripaska for not being on those sanctions, but those were unsuccessful. I mean, Deripaska was still sanctioned, but it shows on the one hand, that standard, the standard. How do the Russians or any intelligence agency, how do they work with assets, and they find money, ideology, compromise, or ego. And this, from reading the indictment, it seems it was for the money, and that'll come out. So certainly, this case of Charles McGonigal is more prominent than Malofeyev. And arguably that's because, McGonigal, Charles, is American. He's one of ours, so to speak, for the people in the West. And, there's another guy mentioned here, Shestakov, Deripaska. Malofeyev would be kind of, in that cast of characters. These other, how many of them are there? It just seems there's an unending supply of swindlers, cheats, and spies, and the only thing I think Malofeyev separates him, he's got a very good name for somebody who does bad things or brings badness. Sorry, my microphone is making some bad sounds, so. We'll see. Malofeyev, this McGonigal case is still playing out before the courts. The indictment's just been unsealed. So I'm sure that there will be more. And the greatest asset, of course, being, or one of the greatest assets, of course, being the ex-president of the United States, Donald J. Trump. And his MAGA supporters, who, Matt Gaetz yesterday submitted a bill about, and they even call it the Ukraine fatigue, about ending U.S. assistance to Ukraine and calling for peace. So you see that the Russians, the Kremlins, they've infiltrated. They've hacked the American political system, and that was clear still with that Cambridge Analytica, Trumpian Steve Bannon world that started 7 years ago.
It certainly gives It certainly gives more weight to the notion of collusion that we've seen in the politics, and it's certainly going to I think the name recognition that you're asking is probably going to be more in the news, given that next year's the lead up to an election year. So the development in itself is a positive development, but that it's not getting much coverage is, I think, connected simply to the U.S.
Well, the thing we got from Gates, and this is what we were discussing off air just a few minutes before we started this conversation, and I just wonder how strong at this stage is this anti-Ukrainian or pro-Trump, pro-Putin faction within the Grand Old Party. So how strong is a support for Gates and his initiative within the rank and file of Republicans?
It sort of depends on how you, to paraphrase Bill Clinton, it depends on how the definition of the word support is. I'd say that it's marginal, but they sure know how to bark very loud. Some of my friends who have Washington connections have said that this is a small minority, and even Biden made mention to that during his State of the Union, that it's not all Republicans, but a vocal minority that are trying to hijack the agenda, as it were. Does that mean that the threat is not worth taking seriously? No. I think we need to all Ukrainian Americans, and not just Ukrainian Americans, but everyone needs to take that threat very seriously, that support for any kind of dictatorship a la Putin is something that you'd think that any advanced or mature nation state or mature country, a mature democracy, would try and stop.
Oh yeah.
Well, and the other thing, of course, is that, and I'm sure this is as clear as day for most people, that the Americans tend to, even put their own partisan politics above international politics or other concerns. And I mean, essentially, it betrays showing these gates and there's 11 congressmen that have signed on to the resolution. They include, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is, a great proponent for this kind of legislation from the Ukraine's point of view, because when you see people of her ilk and her outspokenness in the negative sense, supporting things like that, then it's like, well, if Marjorie thinks it's bad, then it's probably good. One way of putting it, and it'll come out in the wash. I mean, Matt Gaetz is he's like from a political dynasty. His family, his father was in politics. His grandfather was in politics. His grandfather started politics in North Dakota as a mayor of a city here, which is just it's close to the Canadian border. And I'm sure his grandfather would have known Ukrainian immigrants or had interactions with Ukrainian. I think Matt Gaetz down in Florida is beholden to a slightly different public that could be pushing this kind of thing. But I was in D.C. in the Baltimore area late last year, and I met Republicans that are pro-Ukraine, Republicans that are pro-Trump and pro-Ukraine, and trying to understand that it's the Democrat-Republican divide is so fundamental in the States that everything else is secondary. So, there's some Republicans that for them, their first job is to defeat the Democrats. The Democrats are enemy number one. And you kind of, especially sitting in Canada, you shake your head and look at American navel gazing, and you wonder, do these people not see that their divisions that are, supposedly domestic on the domestic front are really having ramifications, very real world ramifications in places like Ukraine, where people are dying. And this, Matt Gaetz is tired. Matt Gaetz has Ukraine fatigue. It's a dangerous line that he's walking, and obviously looks like the Ukrainian contingent in his Florida congressional district isn't important to him.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up, but it's almost, we were talking about this also off before we went live, that we seem to be on the cusp of a generational change. And in a little bit, we're going to be joined by Janusz Bugajski, who is the author of a book that came out last year in English, and we translated into Ukrainian, called Failed State, A Guide to Russia's Rupture. And it made me think about the caliber of discussion amongst policy experts and policymakers in Washington, D.C., inside the Beltway, when, say, Janusz got to Washington, D.C. It was about in the mid-'80s. And it made me wonder if we're suffering from some sort of generational gap in depth and breadth of knowledge about foreign affairs and the intimate connection it has with your domestic affairs as well. And maybe that's something that we can remember to ask Janusz, who's going to join us in a couple of minutes. But yeah,
and perception of Russia
exactly
as a monster state, which was never popular among so many people who treated themselves as some global thinkers. I mean, Kissinger added a lot to that, failed idea of the greatness of Russia. And are those things, I would say, dangerous at the stage when we got the first? I'm trying to get back to this fundamental and breakthrough case that we witnessed a week ago in Manhattan court. So is there a risk that the tendency towards seizing Russian assets and towards recognition of the role of the oligarchs, including Malofeev and Deripaska and others, is there a chance that this may somehow change this tide? Because we know that a year ago, as far as last May, on the Capitol Hill, those people were still reluctant to basically go for Russian assets, for the assets of the Russian central bank, and they were not really willing to seize anything apart from yachts and some fancy assets belonging to the oligarchs, but they were not going for the most, I would say, important asset of Russia, which is the foreign reserves held in foreign currency, including US dollars. So that's a pretty broad question, but let's get to this, if we may.
Well, why don't we do that now with Janusz? He's ready to join.
Janusz is ready to join. That's cool. I have to do one thing before he joins. So I have to remind our audience, I have to remind people who are watching us, we are the independent Ukrainian media. We're not funded by the government. We're not the part of the kind of unified Ukrainian broadcasting system that is funded by the government. We're not a part of any oligarchic media here, and we survive on donations. That's one side of the coin. The other thing is that we started placing ads here, and one of those in one of the smaller companies that is one of the companies that started placing ads at UMN, Ukrainian Media Network, is and I hope that we'll get this the context of this company. Я надіюся, що влада зараз дасть нам. Yeah, so we got a beautiful chance for those who stay in Europe, in particular in Northern Europe, to get a English-speaking and Ukrainian-speaking guide to go and see Iceland, to go and see fjords, and to, you know, to sing to some Björk songs whatsoever. We got this Ukrainian English-speaking community there that is eager to be your guides in that part of the world. So that's one thing. Thank you for that, and let's go to Janusz, I think.
Studio? Janusz?
Janusz має додатися. Janusz is about to join us. In the meantime, I saw his book just yesterday for the first time, and that was a absolutely amazing thing that happened to me while I opened this book, because I saw its first, I would say, the first shipment of this wonderful weapon, and this is a very important weapon to fight Russian idea of greatness, because it debunks it a lot. And the first line I read in this book, oh, Janusz is with us, that's great. First line in this book, I opened it at the page 248, and I got a line about Circassians, or Adigs, and just 2 days ago in our Ukrainian language broadcast we do on Monday and Tuesday, we had a long conversation with a couple of Circassians, or Adigs, ethnic group that is still within the formal borders of Russian Federation, and we had a long talk of how and when there's going to be some solid development of the local, I would say, anti-Russian and anti-Kremlin movement, because a group of these Adigs, or Circassians, I announced a plan to make a Circassian Adigian regiment in Ukraine, potentially within the Foreign Legion or elsewhere within the ZSU, within the military of Ukraine, but they are facing trouble with recruiting people from the Russian-controlled lands. Some of the people potentially are coming from Turkey, but this is a long discussion, and we started it last Monday, and hopefully we'll resume that with Janusz and with other people, and this is going to be one of the, I would say, mainstream topics for our broadcast, because Rost in Imperi.
Right. It's a great question. Janusz, it's good to see you. Thank you for taking the time to join us. Before we get to the answer of the question of the Circassian issue and the General Kavkaz, I think we owe you an introduction. Maybe not, because although maybe it's a small bubble, but I know Janusz Bugajski. He's a senior fellow from the Jamestown Foundation. He has been a policy advisor and think tank, motivating the think tanks in Washington, D.C. to focus on some of the more the issues that particularly affect this part of the world, that is the effects of Russian imperialism and colonialism. And not just from the sense of, he includes the culture, the strategic component, the moral component as well. And the irony of this isn't lost on me, that we are holding up a book of the Ukrainian version on an English language show about the Second Front that Janusz wrote last year. Janusz, thanks again for welcome to the program. Following a bit about what Oleksii is talking about with the Circassians, I was looking into the notion of the Kavkaz, and maybe Americans or English language audiences know too much about that part of the world, but it seems to me that that has a lot to do with Moscow's relationship with Tehran. And maybe you can tell us a bit about the complexities of that part of the world and how it figures into what Moscow may be trying to do strategically by building that new, or resurrecting the old transport between Moscow and Tehran.
Oh, that's a good
Yes,
one.
thanks very much, Marco. Good to see you, and good to see Oleksii,
Great
and
to
good
see
to
you.
see Stefko. I see Stefko also there. And thank you in particular, Marco, for making the book possible. As you said, it's available. You sent me a little video clip of the books themselves delivered, being opened, being sent, and so forth. I'm very happy. Thank you so much. I'm hoping to be in Kiev one of these days soon, maybe to help, if not launch the book, at least to help push the book forward. In answer to your question on the Caucasus, yes, it's a very neglected area, unfortunately, in policy. And there's always been a danger that we still, despite the fact that Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia became independent after the Soviet Union broke up, there was still a danger that US neglected this region, thought it was still some sort of Russian sphere of influence. Just shows you how this idea of Russian empire persists beyond the Soviet Union. And also, unfortunately, allowed greater Chinese and Iranian influence in the region. So I think a major policy turn is required here for the US, but also for Europe, particularly as Russia is weakening, particularly as Iran is developing a closer relationship with Russia, a much more destructive relationship, I would say. I think it's high time that we develop particularly close relations with Azerbaijan. This is a key country in the South Caucasus with enormous oil and gas wealth potential. It's the route to the Central Asia, to the Caspian Basin. They look towards the West increasingly for fear that Russia could stir a new conflict between them and Armenia. So yes, I mean, I fully agree with you. Caucasus is absolutely essential. We're talking about South Caucasus here. There's also the North Caucasus, and what my book does talk about are scenarios whereby populations in the North Caucasus, Chechens, Circassians, as you mentioned, or the Adig people, start to campaign for independence, for self-determination, for breaking clear of Russia, particularly once Russia starts to seriously decline, which I think it will do during the course of this year. And other peoples, there are other peoples in North Caucasus also, in Dagestan, in Kabardino-Balkaria, the Balkar people. There are various groups in the North Caucasus that could start to push for independence. Now, there's an additional question here. One of the things that the West has always feared is what we call balkanization, what has been called balkanization. So the idea that the North Caucasus will fracture into little states that will be unviable. We remember we heard this with the collapse of Yugoslavia. Well, I think some of the activists in the region are now looking at resurrecting something called the Gorna Respublika, which existed briefly before the Bolshevik takeover when the first Russian Empire, the Tsarist Empire, collapsed. A mountain republic which included 6 peoples, if I remember correctly: Chechens, Ingush, Circassians, Nogais, Abkhaz, and one more I can't remember off the top of my Ossets, I think, as well. So they're beginning to talk about this, at least in emigre circles. And of course, a lot of this, I think, will percolate to the local level, to these republics in the North Caucasus. And that's something that will be of direct interest, of course, to Azerbaijan, to Armenia, and particularly to Georgia, which, as you know, borders most of these northern republics and already has 2 republics that have been manipulated by Russia to break away from Georgia. So again, I'm sort of outlining some of the questions that I think we're going to need to handle in the West, Western policy.
Follow up with you on this, because it seems that earlier, before we got you on the stream, Stefko brought up an issue about this generational change, or I called it a generational gap. Now, you've published over 20 books. You've been in Washington, D.C. since the mid-'80s. You've been able to see a certain transition or the change in the caliber and quality that think tanks and policymakers have gone through since that time. And I think it's a legitimate question. Like, how did we miss something that Zbigniew Brzezinski talked about, which was one of the nightmare scenarios in the Grand Chessboard of a Russian, Iranian, Chinese triangle, an axis of sorts? Like, what has happened in your opinion? Maybe this is, it's conjecture and it's subjective, but it seems to me that we lost some of the heavyweights, right? And how did the notion of a pro-Russian lobby get into the discourse inside the Beltway?
Yeah, well, the pro-Russian lobby, I think, is of more recent vintage. It particularly matured during the Trump administration with a more isolationist foreign policy. And of course, Trump himself, who viewed dictators, not so much the Ayatollahs, but certainly Putin, as some sort of a role model because he was strong and tough, allegedly. But the Iranian question, I don't think has ever disappeared. I mean, there is a strong, of course, feeling on both sides of the house that Iran is a major threat, not only to US interests, but to our closest ally in the region, to Israel, an existential threat to Israel, as well as a promoter of terrorism, not just in the Middle East, but throughout the world. So I don't think we've actually taken our eyes too much off Iran. There's a lot of debate about this, the agreement over the nuclear potential development of nuclear weapons. But I think now there should be much more focus for several reasons. One, as you mentioned earlier, Iran has a close relationship or wants to develop the relationship with Armenia and with Russia. And this could stir further conflict. The Azeri-Iranian relationship, remember, is deteriorating. I think that's one of the things we should be looking at. And one thing that's neglected is that there's a huge Azeri population in Iran. There's actually more Azeris in northern Iran than in Azerbaijan. So that's a huge issue as well for Iran. This is where particularly I think we should be focusing, as I mentioned earlier on, John. In answer to your question, I don't think we missed so much Iran. We have certainly missed expertise on Russia. And even the expertise that we did have on Russia was stuck on communism. We failed to see that when communism collapsed, the Russian Empire didn't collapse. And I do believe actually that Ukraine is the main victim of this lack of vision, lack of understanding of what is Russia. This was just one of the iterations, one of the cloaks that Russia used for 70 years during the 20th century. Underneath that, particularly, not so much under Lenin, but particularly under Stalin and his successors, this was much more, let's say, obvious Russian imperialism, Russian expansionism. Our experts, unfortunately, were schooled in the Cold War. There was this idea of a dividend because the Cold War was over. We weren't prepared for the Soviet collapse. If you remember President Bush at the time, the famous Chicken Kiev speech, of course, in which he urged Ukrainians not to go for independence, suicidal nationalism, and all this sort of nonsense. Instead of talking about suicidal imperialism, he was talking about suicidal nationalism. It just shows you how we didn't have sufficient understanding of the core of the Russian state, of the Russian imperial state, which wasn't communism. That was just in Marxist terms, that was just a superstructure. The infrastructure, the base of Russia is its imperial policy amongst elites, and that's continued since Tsarist times. Unfortunately, we don't have the expertise now that we did before. I've been writing about Russia's new imperialism since Putin came to power, so over 20 years. A lot of people poo-pooed it and said, no, Russia we can work with. The word pragmatic crept into our debate, which I think is the most ridiculous word. The idea that Russia was being pragmatic, that Putin we could work with. And again, each of our presidents repeated this in different ways. Now I think people are beginning to look at Russia much more clearly, but there's still a lot of work to be done before we fully understand the nature of this empire.
I want to thank you for raising the issue of Balkanization, and using this word, because from a Ukrainian perspective, when we talk about the West and when we talk about the Capitol Hill and when we talk about the policies and politics in Washington, D.C., and when we look at Ukraine and Ukrainian perception of the Balkans and Northern Caucasus and Southern Caucasus, we have this gap of intelligence. We have this gap in understanding of what actually happens there. And so my question is very practical and cynical in some kind of way. We got the Chechen ethnic battalions here, a few of them We got the exiled leader, one of the exiled leaders, but the one that is more or less recognized in the West, Ahmed Zakayev, who is a frequenter in this studio. And Ukraine recognized the exiled government and gave them a great chance to try to establish a couple of their own regiments here, which is very significant and important politically for the exiled Chechens throughout the world, because they feel and see a chance to go and fight Russia here at the only front line that exists right now at this stage of this global war. Yet, we got this Cherkessian attempts to raise the flag and to join forces with the Ukrainians. We got some sentiments throughout the Balkans, where we got Kosovo, where Ukraine, in a position of a main power fighting Russian aggression right now, has still not recognized Kosovo. And I feel like there's a pretty strong sentiment in Croatia and other places that could also potentially send volunteers to Ukrainian frontline, that they don't feel like Ukraine is really into the global picture and is not really into understanding how important it is to recognize Kosovo, to recognize Cherkessia or Adig's land, to be more global in trying to unite those nations under their own flags and Ukrainian flag in this global war that is actually raging in Ukraine. So my question to Janusz and to Stefko and to Marek is like, hey gentlemen, what should we do with that? We Ukrainians, we whatever, the Westerners. So how should we address this issue right now? Because it feels like this is this high time to start working really fast and going really, really fast to to go for this Rostin Imperi, as Marek would put that.
Maybe
Stefko, do you want me to jump in?
Janusz can lead.
You want me to start? I can start, not a problem. I've been covering the Balkans for over 30 years now, and I don't think there's a more pro-American population than the Albanian population anywhere in Europe. They are fully and completely on the side of Ukraine. They understand what the Ukrainians are going through. They suffered something similar in Kosovo under the Serbs, under the Serbian regime of Slobodan Milosevic, who increasingly Putin is imitating in terms of the brutality and the murderous nature of this regime in the Kremlin. So I would say Ukraine and some Ukrainian politicians have already reached out. And Mr. Goncharenko has already talked about and appealed for the Ukrainian parliament, Ukrainian government to recognize Kosovo. I think that would be a huge success for Kosovo. I think it will also be a huge blow both to Moscow and its proxy in the Balkans, which is the Vučić regime in Serbia. So yes, Kosovo is one. There are other countries, of course, that I talk about that will emerge from Russia. Ukraine may be bordering Circassia or bordering the Kuban, which hopefully won't become a source of dispute, because parts of Circassia reached as far as what is now the Kuban, but the recognition of, for instance, the Circassian genocide, just like with the Holodomor, is extremely important. The recognition that there are huge diaspora. I mean, the diaspora of the Circassians, I think, is something like 7 or 8 times bigger outside the country, in places like Turkey, Jordan, and so forth. Ukrainians, I think, should be reaching out to these people in various formats. And in terms of battalions or volunteers willing to fight for Ukraine, I can tell you for sure that there will be many Albanians and other people from the Balkans that would want to fight by your side, because they see the common danger as Russian imperialism. Russia is destabilizing the Balkans as well as Ukraine and other countries.
Stavko?
Thank you, Janusz, for reminding us about the Chicken Cave speech. And I was thinking along the same lines, and these warnings of suicidal nationalism, and really that your point about suicidal imperialism is what seems to be playing out now. But you can't help but think that there's a feeling of deja vu with 91 in that the Americans are, or in the U.S. and in the West, that they're more concerned about the aftermath of a fragmentation and the control over the nuclear weapons. And I can't help but think that part of it is that nobody has a vision of or an idea of what Russia might look like after it is fragmented and has gone through the processes of denazification, demilitarization, and so forth. And I'm wondering if that's due to a lack of imagination on the Beltway and in other in European and American Canadian centers, that the fear of the unknown, this fear that of these nuclear weapons ending up in the hands of like a Kadyrov or a Prigozhin type, which seems ridiculous, but who knows? And I'm wondering if that lack of imagination in Western capitals, or that fear of Russia falling apart, it provides kind of an opportunity for Ukraine, and who better than Ukraine after better part of the country being 350 years under the part of the Russian Empire, and maybe it's up to Ukraine to propose the vision, like assuming that there's a victor circle in this war, and there's no reason to expect that there won't be, and Ukraine will definitely be in it, and can assume that the United States will be there as well. But those people in the victor circle are kind of that victory is fine, but what about a vision for what how do we handle Russia, and what do we need to be afraid of, what don't we need to be afraid of, and who better than the Ukrainian people to kind of say, hey, we know what this is about, and we've been telling you this for X number of years, and this is how it can be done, and in some ways allay those fears, that, oh my God, what's going to happen to Russia and the nukes? Is anybody giving those answers? Does anybody have those answers? Certainly the Russian so-called liberals or others don't seem to be, at least for my limited media consumption, proposing anything. They're just kind of waiting. It seems almost like they're waiting on the sidelines for things to play out. And, well, maybe it's up to Ukraine to say, hey, don't worry about it. And this is the way it's going to play out. Is that a reasonable...
Yeah, if I could jump in after Steko, you raised some very good points. This whole nuclear question, I mean, Ukraine is perfectly positioned to talk about denuclearization for countries that emerge from Russia. Whatever the argument one would make now, that if Ukraine had nuclear weapons, it would have prevented a Russian attack. But on the other hand, I wouldn't approach it that way with Western policymakers. I would stress the fact that we denuclearized, as did Kazakhstan, as did Belarus. Other countries that emerged from Russia can do the same. So this idea of loose nukes used by new countries is a misnomer. It's an exaggeration. Secondly, I would say that, yes, Ukraine can take a lead role in establishing, forging ties with various diasporas, but also eventually with those countries that are emerging from the Russian Federation. We've already seen a little bit of this with the Chechens and hopefully with the Circassians. I would also urge that working closely with your neighbors, working closely particularly with the Poles and with the three Baltic countries on these questions. So you're not sort of out alone, seen as the breaker up of Russia. In other words, that you have a group of countries that are committed, that understand that the only way to prevent future Russian attacks is actually to deimperialize this country and allow the indigenous peoples and regions to go their own way and create new contacts with them, new allies with them. So again, be at the forefront, but don't act alone. That would be my advice.
Well, here's a provocative question for me. I mean, what are the chances? I mean, the bigger picture. I mean, I know it sounds almost churlish to bring it up, but the bigger picture for me is that if Moscow establishes or reestablishes or even finishes its dream, I mean, the Iranian ports were part of the delivery for the land lease that the United States provided to the Soviet Union during World War II. I see what the Russians are trying to do, what Moscow's trying to do is reestablish that corridor through either the Caspian or the railway land, so that they can basically, you no longer need to use Suez Canal, for example. My question is that I agree that we need to talk with our neighbors, but what about creating new neighbors? What are the chances of creating, for example, a Kavkaz Federation that would basically, from the Caspian to the Black Sea, cut off access that Moscow is trying to get from the north south to Tehran, and the Iranians can't get from the south north to Moscow in order to hasten the rupture that we're talking about? Because we're all making I think we're making very moral-based arguments, and despite my disdain, like guttural disdain for Mearsheimer, he's right that the U.S. foreign policy establishment has divorced morality from strategy. I think part of our effort should be to put them back together, obviously, because the moral component is I mean, it's important. It should be the driving engine of strategy, but apparently it isn't in most cases. And so what are the chances of something like that emerging that would entice the community that doesn't want to unite morality with strategy, so that they see, you know what, a Kavkaz Federation is actually in our strategic interest because it weakens Moscow, it weakens China, it weakens Iran. It prevents the nightmare scenario that Brzezinski talked about, again, in the book, right? It's an important question. Is that feasible?
And that's where Ukraine should step in, and because the problem with mixing the strategy and morality, that's the Western problem. While with us, it's the chaotic nature of Ukrainian policies and politics that are like, we still got people who don't have them on board the presidential office, luckily, but they will promoting the idea of occupying Kuban, which is naturally a Circassian territory, and which is one of the things that makes Circassians, the Adigs, absolutely mad about Ukraine. Because what are you talking about? This is our land. And sorry, I just jumped in, but
that's why I say a Kavkaz Federation, that some kind of structure that would hasten their independence and also hasten, or at least begin that process of dismantling of that federation, or that ersatz federation, that imperial structure that the Kremlin seems to somehow always resurrect.
Yeah, let me jump in. Oleksii, you raise a very good point. Divide and rule has been a traditional Russian policy of subject peoples. And we see this particularly how they've used the Armenians, how they've used the Ossets to their advantage in the Caucasus. So, and you're absolutely right, Marko, some sort of mountainous federation, confederation, understanding even early on, even before these structures are created, how we're going to cooperate together, how it's to our advantage to work together. And I'm sure they would get support from neighboring countries, from Georgia, from Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, on the other side of the Caspian, who do not want to see an Iranian Russian condominium across this region. They want to break this up. They want to have free access to the West.
That's a good point. I think it's something that our foreign policy, again, right? And then we get back to this issue about the quality of thinking in various foreign policy institutions, be it the MFA here or State Department in DC. It seems there's like a lack of creative thinking to solve some of these issues. I bring that up because one of the things that there was a diplomat from the EU recently, he was on radio in London, Guy, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce his last name, but it began with the letter V. Good guy, and he had said that, I mean, again, I don't think it's armchair quarterbacking, but it's looking at the past and sort of saying something that may be obvious now, that if Brexit didn't happen, Putin may not have had the interest in invading Ukraine a second time in 2022. Like, they look for those weak points, and they exploit them very well, the Russian establishment, the Russian foreign policy establishment. Otherwise, well, how do you explain Lavrov's tour through Africa, through the African continent so often? I mean, these are issues that I would hope that, you know, your book is making its way through the swamp of Russophilia that seems to be rising up like the tide with the moons in DC. And I think that's one of my biggest fears, is that there's not enough creative thinking and gaming this out that we used to do in the 80s and 90s.
Mm-hmm. As a follow-up, Marko, by the way, and for our viewers, we are arranging a conference actually next Tuesday, Valentine's Day, on the breakup of Russia. Jamestown Foundation together with the Hudson Institute, and we have actually very good speakers from myself, Paul Goebel, of course, who's, if you like, the long-term strategist. For many years, he's been talking about the breakup of Russia. In addition, we have the foreign minister of the Ichkerian Republic. We have Mr. Gonchenikov from the Ukrainian Parliament. We have somebody from the Free Russia Foundation, a Buryat lady who's very much for Buryat independence as well. So it should be a good conference starting at 9 o'clock Washington time. And I think online, if you go to either Jamestown or Hudson, you'll be able to find the link.
Great. We'll put that in our description below. If you can send me that link, so that when this stream ends, a file ends up on YouTube, and then we'll just keep it there so people could sign up to it.
And Goncharenko finally learned the lesson, which is a good news, because he was also hot about this, I would say, very medieval and very inadequate and childish rhetorics that some of the local politicians were using, like Kuban is ours. Again, you know, cosplaying Russian strategies, which is unfortunately still an issue in Ukraine in many layers of its culture. But he stopped doing that immediately after meeting some of the Circassians in Turkey. And so, yeah, they're slow to learn, but finally they learn. And this is just a remark.
Yeah, and
in the meantime,
if I could add how the Russians have been trying to stir conflicts between Ukraine and its NATO members. You know, they're very successful with Hungary, but completely unsuccessful with Poland or Slovakia. But they're still trying. There's still this sort of divide and rule. That they're going to do the same thing between Ukrainians and the nations emerging from Russia.
You know, I have to say a funny story that you mentioned. The Albanians, a friend of mine in London was having work being done on his apartment, and he asked the gentleman who was coming in to do the work, he says, you know, where are you from? He has a heavy accent. He says, I'm British. He goes, well, everybody's British, but you know, who are you? He says, I'm Albanian. He goes, oh, I'm Ukrainian. And then they just went all over the whole thing with the Kremlin, that this is why it's bad, Putin, Huilo, all of the whole 9 yards. So when you say that the small data is what's, I think, to me, very, it's very romantic, because that's where the real policy is, right? That's where the real data comes from. We've already seen the mistakes. And I'm not saying to divorce ourselves completely from big data. What I am saying is that we got to keep the pulse on that small data. And you seem to be able to know, like, all of the small data together. And that's, again, I'm going to make a plug for the book in the Ukrainian language. But if you want the English book, it's available as a PDF on jamestownfoundation.org's website. And it's well worth your time to download and read. If you're a Ukraine watcher, if you think that people like Roger Waters need to shut the F up and brush up on what history is instead of regurgitating the Kremlin line, go to jamestownfoundation.org, Jamestown Foundation's website. Google will tell you what the address is, actually. And if you go looking for the Ukrainian version, it's on failedstate.com.ua. We have to take
one more thing. Yeah, of course, because, you know, we are this is this minute of ads, and we're placing ads here at UMN, Ukrainian Media Network, and we got a wonderful group of guides in Iceland that are English-speaking, Ukrainian-speaking. If you happen to be Ukrainian or English speaker somewhere in Northern Europe and you want to see the Vikings, land in Iceland and the fjords and listen to Björk and and have some fun, distract yourself from a resurrected, a two-headed chicken, and just have fun and enjoy yourself a few days in Iceland. We got a group of people to supply you with this great guide. And with this opportunity to have
historical link between Vikings and Kievan Rus. A good opportunity.
That's exactly. I was just thinking the same thing.
That's the thing.
I was just thinking the same thing. In fact, there was a Netflix series, and there's a scene apparently where Volodymyr the Great is in a tent apparently, and it's this Netflix series Vikings, and so yeah, there's a connection there too.
Anyhow, one thing
I've had a chance. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Stefko.
I was just gonna add. I've had an opportunity to read the book and work on the Ukrainian language text. And one thing that comes out, and this is kind of for Ukraine to think about, and that is and the messaging to the Ukrainians within Russia, right, that are living, I don't know, it must be at least like Soviet times, being a Ukrainian patriot, or fear of showing any patriotism or any support for Ukraine. But I don't have an answer. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But what is Ukraine doing enough to let the Ukrainians within the Russian Federation, who are, if I'm not mistaken, the second most populous ethnic group, are we as Ukraine doing enough to let them know that, hey, it's okay, we're going to win this? You can do your part. Or are they so the citizens of the Russian Federation so far gone that their Ukrainianness is no longer relevant or important to them?
Well, you know how good Russians were at Russification, and in particular on the local, so to say, Ukrainians residing on the Russian terrain, and it's just like popped up in my mind when you were talking, when you were saying this. I just recalled again the story of Malofeev and the story of this Russian oligarch whose assets are finally seized by the Manhattan court a week ago, and whose name is not so popular in the West, but we're trying to promote it and to make it more, I would say, to make this case a breakthrough case. But again, Malofeev, for those who do not know, was one of the authors of the concept of reviving monarchy in Russia, and he was one of those to promote the idea of Putin becoming a new Tsar, technically. And so he, alongside with his Tsargrad TV company and the big chunk of the local Orthodox Church, which is of course again a KGB project starting from early 40s, but he was trying to do that. But ironically, Putin never needed that in the end, because he was the first Soviet woman astronaut, Tereshkova, who brought this bill to Duma, to the parliament, that gave Putin an opportunity to become a de facto Tsar of Russia without changing the concept of this weird empire. But again, who is Tereshkova now? And now when we look at the origin of her name, this is a Ukrainian surname that was Russified a few decades ago, a couple of centuries ago, I don't know, but this is a Ukrainian, so she is one of those Ukrainians on the Soviet, on the Russian soil, who was Russified to become basically more than a protagonist to Putin, but to become his main ally in de facto turning him into a monarch.
If I could quickly jump in, Stefko, I completely agree with you. I think this is something that Ukrainians should also be looking at into the future, because I think as Russia weakens, a lot of Ukrainians who have been Russified, sometimes that Russification is on the surface. You rediscover your roots, your Ukrainian roots. And I think the Ukrainian population in the Russian Federation is probably much bigger than any census actually reveals. Particularly this last census, which I gather is a complete disaster, the figures, about a fifth of the population didn't even declare the nationality. But in the Far East, you know, these wedges, green wedges, gray wedges, all these Ukrainian klimen that exist in different parts of the Russian Federation. It wouldn't surprise me if increasingly that will fuel the movement for regional liberation in different parts of the Russian Federation, particularly in the Far East and Siberia. So again, this is something that Kiev should not neglect. These are people that are originally Ukrainian and that will be rediscovering their Ukrainian roots.
Yeah, it's a good point. I remember back in I'm going to mess up the year, 93 or 94, when Khasbulatov and Rudskoy had occupied the Russian Duma. I was in the Institute for Anthropology, and I showed up with my really bad broken Russian, and everyone around the table, we were constructing a database of ethnic conflicts, early warning system for ethnic conflicts, and they asked me my background, and I said Ukrainian, and everyone around the table said, "Oh, my baba's from Ukraine. Oh, my dido's from Ukraine. I'm from Ukraine. I go there every summer." So there's that really interesting connection, which in many ways is sort of you kind of threw the gauntlet down too, because this is something that Roman Skripin talks about in this program we've been doing called Rostin Imperii, the autopsy of empire, where we find ways to see how it's going to end or what's coming next. And you come to the conclusion that a lot of Ukrainians had a lot to do with the creation either of or were involved in the institutionalizations of the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, and it's a history. I think that's where the Canadian experience, or at least even maybe the South African experience with the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, comes into play. So that there's an interesting article that came out today about don't overly criticize. It was written by he was an academic professor that was arrested, basically sort of a mea culpa as to why Russians aren't protesting. And it's an interesting point that Stefko brings up, because and that you're saying, Janusz, that if there is that many Ukrainians that could possibly coalesce into a some form of community, they could facilitate that kind of Truth and Reconciliation Commission when things settle down, or when Ukraine finally emerges with its territory and sovereignty intact. It's a good point. Stefko?
Another point I can make, and I absolutely agree with the importance of looking again at the global moves that Russia's making, and in terms of what's happening in Lavrov's trips and diplomacies in Africa, and that certainly works with Putin's rhetoric of saying that, we're fighting the collective West, or the West. So by dividing the world into West and South, and us and them, and Russia is that messaging that the West we're at war against the West, is aimed at resonating in the global South, in places that might have had a bad experience with the Anglo-Saxon version of the imperialism, and that is something that again, it's more of an foreign affairs, but that, I don't know if that's the second front or is that already a third front that has to be fought.
Yeah, absolutely right. If I could
Particularly,
jump in,
that's important. Janusz raised that thing. Sorry, Janusz. Yeah, just jump in real quick. You raised that one, and Stifko just said. And Lavrov is really active there in Africa and in the Middle East right now after this huge earthquake that took lives of tens of thousands of people in Turkey and Syria. And they are, in my understanding, according to a few sources from Chechen diaspora, they are infiltrating Turkey by the means of some Kadyrov cronies that are now there with the rescue crews, and nobody knows what in fact they're doing there. Just a little, paragraph on that. Sorry for.
Yeah, I was just going to say, in the bigger picture, it's clear that the more Russia is exposed as a colonial power, the more it's going to try and project that back on the West. Because remember, during the whole communist period, the whole premise of the Soviet Union was that it was anti-imperialist. In other words, it's actually a disguise for anti-American or anti-Western. A lot of our academics and a lot of policymakers that came out of that tradition did not view the Soviet Union, unfortunately, as an imperial and colonial state, which of course it was. Probably even more vicious than many West European colonial states, if you look at the treatment of different populations, particularly Ukrainians, but also many other nations. And I think that hangover continues, and Moscow is exploiting that to the hilt with countries like India. I mean, I'm in touch with these Indian guys who seem to think that Russia has never been a colonial country. I said, well, what hypocrites are you? What did the British do to you for all these generations? And now you are on Russia's side against subject peoples, against indigenous peoples. I think, again, this is something where Ukraine, having been one of the primary victims of Russian colonialism, can forge better relations with African, Latin American, Asian states and explain to them exactly what Russian imperialism and colonialism and Russification amounted to.
Absolutely, and here
fascinating point that you're making. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
This is a fascinating point that you're making because it's been sticking with me since returning from London. That, and again, one of the vehicles I think that they use to exploit that or distort that understanding of imperialism versus occupation is the novel. And I mean, Eva Thompson in Imperial Knowledge talks exactly about the use, how the Russian Empire, the Kremlin, basically abuses, misuses literature and those forms of, I don't know what to call them vehicles, but they're like instruments of wielding power to as the empire expanded. Eva Thompson is one of the few that talked about that vis-a-vis the Russian Empire, Soviet Union. Yet Western academics did the same thing, but they always stopped right at the border with the Russian Empire. I mean, even today, right, when you see these maps that we draw, and this is a direct result of that, you'll see Europe broken up with its borderlines, but there's just Russia, really big letters splotched out, and there are so many indigenous countries there, and well, no wonder that people are going to have this perspective that we can't negotiate, we can't let that fall apart. You get a fear factor probably in some think tanks thinking close to the National Security Council saying, whoa, we need to concentrate nuclear powers with these guys. This is the thing that I find, it keeps me up late at night wondering, how did their propaganda and cultural expansion work to that degree that it can convince Indians that they are the anti-imperial power. It baffles the mind that they managed to do this.
Well, with India, and that was a point I was going to make, because I'm coming to you from Canada, where you kind of get to go around the world without leaving your city, because we are a nation of immigrants, and you get to interact with with people from all over the world, and certainly among the Southeast Asians here, you say Winston Churchill to them, it's a little bit different than, Zelensky's Winston Churchill, Winston Churchill. You keep repeating that. But Winston Churchill for the Indian subcontinent has very different connotations, and that's also the if in the Russian rhetoric about the Anglo-Saxons, the Anglo-Saxon, that has emerged certainly more recently. I don't even remember that from the Soviet times. Anglo-Saxons, that seems to be a modern Putinist convention. But, we have to be cognizant of that. And the Russians are certainly tailoring their messages to each audience. They know how to do that. And Ukraine has to be cognizant of that when you're screaming Zelensky's Winston Churchill, which is great for, in London, but in New Delhi, that has certainly a different connotation.
It's not very good in Warsaw either, as Poland as the first ally was betrayed after World War II. So I'd be careful with Churchill.
Neither in Hamburg, Germany.
And it doesn't play very well in London either, frankly. The people I spoke with anyway. But yeah, that's a problem with communications writ large. I mean, it's a small plug for ourselves why independent media has got such I think a leg up on others, that we can see this issue is not exactly that's promoted, and it's not the pablum that's being put on the shelves of your average media consumer. Janusz, it's been we've had you for 45 minutes. I want to say thank you for so much time, for letting us manipulate your time like that. I hope that we can see you again. I know that if anyone's interested, that Stavko did a long-form interview that's on UMN with you that we edited for content. And I hope that we'll stay in touch, clearly, but I hope that we can have you back on the program.
And we wait for you in Kiev.
Yeah, and we're gonna wait for you to.
I've enjoyed it so much. I haven't really noticed how time has gone. I've overran 20 minutes that I was supposed to, but thank you. Please count me in for the future.
All right. Thanks a lot, Janusz.
Thank you, Janusz. And this book that Janusz Bugajski just, he finished it a while ago, but we finally got the Ukrainian version of this excellent work. And so for those who read Ukrainian and English, this book is now for sale, and Marek Suprun is in charge. So here we go. In the meantime, I gotta make a little ad here, announcement that we have. We are the independent media that is doing the work without any state funding and oligarch funding, and so we're trying to develop, and we do develop a basic business model for any media. So we sell ads, and there's if our producer would show the email for those who want to place ad at Ukrainian Media Network, that would be probably in a different that would be a different graphics. Влад, покажи, будь ласка, як показати рекламу, e-mail Skripina. So I just want to show you the email address for those who want to contact the UMN and place their ad, which would happen in a while. In the meantime, I'm just reminding you that we got a beautiful bunch of people in Iceland who would be your guides in this land, and they have guides in English and in Ukrainian who would lead you through the fjords and the land of Vikings. That's it. Cool. We got it.
We got it.
It was the third time. We still have to do it one more time until the end of the broadcast. In the meantime, Gentlemen, I want to ask you to brief me a little bit and to help me with getting ready for the Ramstein and Defense Ministers Summit in Brussels. Finally, I got an accreditation and I got a clearance from Ukrainian Minister of Culture, which surprised me a bit, but I'm thankful for that. As a Ukrainian male under 47, I got to get a permission to get out of the country for 2-3 days to visit some people in Brussels. This time, these are Jens Stoltenberg and Ben Wallace and potentially Lloyd Austin. I don't promise you an exclusive content on this channel, but I do promise you some insights from our sessions in Brussels, and so we're gonna get back to this next week and next Friday. But in the meantime, I'm really puzzled with this chunk of news coming from all over Europe and the US on what do we actually expect from our Western partners. For those who do not know, like Zelensky is a name now. It's a global and it's absolutely recognizable. But we got also Andriy Yermak, who is one of the shadow figures in Zelensky's team, who did a pretty blatant, I would say, a provocation on his Telegram channel a couple of days ago, announcing that we already got an accord with the Westerners that we are getting F-16s, I think, which was a piece of fake news that was unfortunately aired by a few media outlets here, but later he changed his stance, and now we do not have a particular idea of what exactly we're getting. But in a couple of days, we'll have more information on that, hopefully from Ben Wallace and from Lloyd Austin. So what do you guys think we could expect during next week's Defense Ministerial in Brussels? Is there any significant news that we could expect indeed?
Stavko?
Well, I certainly don't have any insights or insides into what is going to be has been called the air Rammstein, right? I mean, I just hope that as opposed to Yermak, they're listening to Zaluzhny and getting his list and Zaluzhny still, what he and Zablotsky wrote back in the fall time about, our capacity is what we're lacking. The Russians are able to strike us at will, and within Kazani, there's no, they can't be held accountable. There's no answering to that. And in terms of broad strokes, can only hope that the next Rammstein will, give Ukraine enough to achieve that.
Well, I mean, my take on it is that it's going to be an emerging, if not already an existing institution that's going to supplant NATO in its drive to sort of is a security construct for the continent, because it includes, it's really almost a global construct, I would say, because it includes not just the European continents, but there's Japan as part of it, another, I think even North Korea, South Korea is part of it as well. So I think it's going to be more of the same. I don't anticipate that we're going to lose any support. I have no concerns regarding, say, how Reznikov is going to be perceived after this internal issue with regard to procurement at the Ministry of Defense in Ukraine.
If he's even going, which is also a question, I don't know. Well,
I would be very surprised. I think that this has been the internal issue that Ukraine went through regarding the procurement. There was a comment by, and I'm going to screw up his name, Zhumadilov, I think, that basically he wrote on Facebook that basically it's the way that the Ministry of Defense does its procurement is what the problem is. That he doesn't suspect that there was any malfeasance, that there wasn't any effort, and I think that we need to give Reznikov the benefit of the doubt. I think he handled it quite well, especially with the announcement of a military prozoro. I mean, we have to grow up a little bit because, you know, the United States has DARPA, as the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. Not everything that they do regarding security is open source and available. Now, maybe that's an anachronism. I don't know, and I think that's an interesting conversation to have. But I think that Reznikov is going to be greeted if he goes, and I suspect that he will because it's the ministers of defense. I don't think that what happened here regarding procurement is going to affect the relationship, and nor is it going to affect Rammstein's further commitment to peace and security and defending and helping Ukraine defend itself to the end. I mean, I think that see, for me, that's one of the most positive developments where the morality is coming back into the strategy. And I think they were artificially removed, and I think this Rammstein is that way that they're going to get back together. So that's sort of my take. If we get planes, that's great. But I think if we get Grey Eagle drones, that's going to be another game changer.
Yeah, I mean, anyway, we're talking planes. We're not talking eggs and a potato for the army. And so I completely agree with you that it would not be any so to say minor or mediocre corruption scandal here would not really be a game changer in terms of global support for Ukraine, which is absolutely, I think we can take it for a fact. But what would you ask Reznikov if you meet him? Because I have this mixed feelings about this whole situation, because we know that the contracts for supplying army with the foods and stuff was always a hodivnitsa, was always a feeder for local bureaucrats, and there was always corruption in it, and this is the name of the game here in Ukraine, unfortunately. While all the Russian bullshit they were spreading around the globe about chances that javelins or Abrams tanks or anything serious could get to Russian hands, which is absolute nonsense. So we just cannot mix those things up. But anyway, whatever happened, and we still got Reznikov, and we got Rammstein, and we got our strong position there. Hopefully, what would you ask Reznikov if you meet him? Because I may have this chance next Monday or Tuesday, and so I may bring in a quote or two if I'm lucky, so we could discuss it next Friday.
Stavko?
Well, to be honest, I don't know if I would ask him much beyond whether or not, trying to understand why he is so vital in that position. I mean, in theory, it shouldn't matter if it's Reznikov or or somebody called Simonenko or Suprun or Bobrovnikov, right? That shouldn't matter. So, as opposed to asking, I would try to understand what is it so, I don't know, special or what is, or try to understand if he's committed to holding on to that seat, or if he understands that it's not about him being in the seat, if the optics and the corruption allegations, certainly if you watch some of the talking heads out of DC, they don't like Reznikov. I'm going to be very specific here, because it's Yuri Shvets who, on his wildly popular YouTube channel, has been giving Reznikov and corruption a hard time. And that's not a bad thing in itself, but if it becomes a problem, would Reznikov go? and and hopefully the system is such.
Yeah, sorry. Sorry for interrupting.
No, Reznikov has said, I think you were saying, you're going to say Reznikov?
Yeah, that he serves as the president, that he's not holding on to his seat. He's not, white knuckling the chair. If he's got to go, he's got to go. I mean, my issue with, that someone like Schwetz, an old KGB crony, doesn't like Reznikov, that speaks volumes. That, again, unfortunately, I see a Russian behind every lamppost sometimes, and I can't for the life of me think that a story around when I heard about it, what they're arguing between what side of the egg is rounder, right? I mean,
literally,
almost literally, right? And I thought, this has got special ops all over it. Why is Reznikov so important? Because I think that we're on the beginning of a new relationship and a new international system at play. I mean, we're looking at exactly the kind of relationship that we've always thought would be good for Europe, a Kiev, Warsaw, Vilnius, UK axis, right? Kiev, it's something that I think and Brussels. I don't want to always forget about Brussels, but that those cities are going to become leaders in what I think is going to be a new system. And we're only a year into this, and I think that switching out a key minister doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But we're going to be facing that challenge coming up very soon because Ukraine's going to be supposed to be having elections very soon, right? And so the test that you're talking about, the institutions, Steph, that will they be able to survive? I think they'll be able to survive. I think Ukraine will be able to survive. I think it's going to be a really interesting next 18 months.
Well, in case there'd be an election and stuff. While you were talking, Marco, I was thinking of if Ronald Reagan would knew this joke from the Soviet times, and this applies to Reznikov a lot, in my humble opinion. It's just almost like about the plumber and the famous one. So there was this joke about Reznikov, which I am, as a Ukrainian, and also as a witness to quite a few bureaucratic, to say the least, inadequacies here, would be in a position to say it's about the plumber again, but not the one that comes to the ordinary Soviet household, but who comes to Kremlin, and he's asked to fix the leak and to fix the stuffed system, and he says, and he takes a look. He's doing his own inquiry into what happens with this leak, and he says, oh yeah, and he received 20 years in Gulag for that, and he says, oh no, it can't be fixed. We got to change the whole system here. That's pretty much about the side
Right.
of the egg and the bureaucracy that is still there. In the meantime, again, I don't want to look ridiculous, but this is a part of my job tonight.
Well,
and
hold
I gotta remember to our viewers that we do sell ads.
Correct.
We are doing a very basic things that any media would do, and we're not funded by state money or any oligarch cash. But what we do is we try to build a regular business model for any media. So one of our first companies that placed an ad at UMAN is a small, tiny, but a wonderful travel company in Iceland that could offer you a service of a guide who's both Ukrainian and English speaker, and who would lead you to this wonderful land of Vikings, Bjork, and
The Pirate Party.
Iceland as it is. Yeah.
The Pirate Party.
Yeah. We're almost still. Okay. Yeah, and there would be how would you say that in English?
I couldn't see it.
So,
Link,
yeah,
we're
we've
gonna
got
have
a
a
link.
link to the a link in the description below the video after
Yeah.
for this. At the end, there's also going to be another advertisement for this Icelandic
tour guide.
tour guides.
Vikings in Iceland. But we were supposed to finish at 1930 Kiev time. So,
Our experiment has gone long.
yeah.
Stavko, the experiment has gone long. It's run out of control. Get the hazmat suits. Essentially, well, Stavko, I guess thanks for being part of the experiment. It's something we've talked about, an English language program. In fact, just a little bit of nostalgia here. Stavko actually was part of one of the first English language news programs on Piate Kanal on Channel 5 back in the day.
This is where we met.
Where you guys met.
This is where we met, and this is where we met Skripin and this whole, crew that is now running UMN. So yeah, that's the thing. So we really hope to reestablish some sort of a whatsoever analytical or just
I think that
a conversation genre.
Yeah. Definitely, Ukrainians are really ahead above when it comes to knowing many languages. And what has certainly come across here in the West, and why Ukraine's done a great job in communicating in this war, not just Zelensky, is that there's a lot of English language speakers. And the key to people's hearts in the West is speaking, in their language or everywhere in the world, in the lingua franca. So I think that let's do it. Let's do some more and let people know that there's a different perspective, a little bit of a different view on things. That is different from the mainstream media that we in the independent media are not beholden to anybody. So yeah, let's keep doing it. I had fun.
Me too. You had fun. Me too. And we started doing it a few months ago with the second front, Другий front, in Ukrainian. We already got a very solid, I would say, team throughout the world, and we got a couple of people that we were interviewing in English and then try to do a translation while on air. But we have people in the Middle East. We have our contacts in northern Kurdistan, in Iraq, in Syria, and I just had a few conversations with people from northern Kurdistan and from Iraqi Kurdistan, from northern Iraq and from Syria yesterday after this absolutely horrible bombardments by Bashar Assad's regime of the territories that were hit badly by the earthquake, and that coincidentally are also a stronghold of the Syrian opposition. And so they were hitting those territories with potentially with the Russian or Soviet-made weapons, because this is the core of Bashar Assad's military. And hopefully next week or in the upcoming days, we'll have a chance to peep in the situations there, because this is really hard to get a first-hand evidence from these regions, but we are working on it right now. And even during the podcast, our on-air thing, I was receiving messages from a couple of sources in Iraqi Kurdistan that were, trying to shed some light on what is happening there. So we have our people in Germany. We are, happy to introduce and again to remind you that we have Stefan Bandera in Canada, and Marek Suprun is now in Kiev. And we also had fun. So this is about having fun, because when you're not having fun, it will not work. No way. So this is what we're about to resume doing. And thank you, gentlemen, for being here. And thanks a lot for your time. And last but not least, I want to remind you that yes, we have a company in Iceland that is giving you a chance to have a magnificent trip to the fjords and to this absolutely beautiful location in the northern Europe that is, apart from being a homeland for one of the best soccer teams, which surprisingly did a great job a few years ago and is still a name on the European continent. It's also a place where you can get an English and Ukrainian speaking guide. And this is the number that you could call if you're in Northern Europe. You could just do this trip. Yeah. And there's a link in
the description
below.
Right. The link for the Icelandic vacation spot is in the description below. You have to give us a little bit of some leeway where I'm new to this. The media experts here around me have been quite good at it, but they were used to probably an old media form where they had people doing things for them. We have to sort of think on our feet. But in any event, thanks for the opportunity. This has been great. I think we're going to do a lot more. There's a lot of, it's a big world, but it's also a small village. And I think we can figure things out and make the world a little bit better.
And a little bit funnier, anyway. We try to laugh at things that are, considered sacred sometimes. And Ukraine is a very specific place for that, too. So it's always, we're testing ourselves and we're testing our viewers too. Hopefully we have not, stepped on anyone too, but we will try to do that next time, and we'll step at someone's too.
Okay.
Good.
Sign off.
Yep, that's it.
Take care.
Thanks, Stefan. See you soon. Papa.
Glory to Ukraine.
Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава.